Are you ready for another rant?
But if that was up, I mean, whipping your ass up and down this street. Yeah, bro. Are you screaming?
So welcome back to Round Rant. I am absolutely over the moon to be joined today by Rory Sutherland, who is the Vice Chairman of Ogilvy in the UK and is also the writer of several books that you may have read, may have known, including Alchemy and Transport for Humans. So with the intro done and dusted, Rory, I suppose it'd be rude of me not to ask you
Not
how's
too
all
bad.
of you
Slightly
today.
busy day. It's bloody freezing outside. For some reason, it says high load on my device struggling to record. And I have no idea why. There is a Mac app, but there's no Windows app, is there? Okay. I have no idea why it's struggling to record, unless there's just a shortage of disk space, but that can't be right. Sorry about this. I'm really pissed off with this.
Yeah. Well, no, I think I have you.
Let's just soldier on. No. Other than the fact that it's bloody freezing here, where are you?
I'm in Dublin, Ireland.
It's pretty much the same
much
boat. Yeah,
same boat as
fantastic.
you.
Okay. No, I have no idea what this is doing, and I can't work out what on earth is going on. It's been fine all day, and it's for some reason it's gone massively laggy. Let me just click on this PC just in case. Nope, there's plenty of fucking space here. Oh well, never mind. We'll just see if we can high load. I've closed everything else down, for crying out loud. Oh, it's not some stupid bloody VPN, is it? Hold on. Right, I'll try and get the.
I'd say you're all right. The beauty of technology
it's so
says
weird
so.
that it's. Oh, I know. Okay, let's close this down. Settings, and I'll just close this down. I think it's trying to connect to a VPN and failing, and they're being utterly stupid about it. Sorry about this. I'll sort this out. Right. Okay. I think this might get better now. Okay. Let's try. Let's try from now on. Okay. We're all right. It'll get better, I hope. Right. No. Apart from the fact that it's bloody freezing, I'm pretty much fine. No problem at all.
Good stuff. Well, I thought I'd dive straight into the deep end. Like normally, if I have guests on, I tend to ask them about their childhood and get some sort of sob story going. But I'd rather skip forward to present day, where I was only thinking last night where an incredibly annoying Coors Light ad came on. I thought it'd be an appropriate question to ask you right here, right now. What is the last marketing ad or poster you've seen that has actually made an impression on you?
I'm going to be controversial here and say that I'm a defender of the Jaguar advertising to an extent, because I think what they're doing, although it breaks all the rules of conventional branding, i.e. adhering slavishly to your existing visual cues, which are familiar to your target audience. The problem they've got is they need a new target audience, because they aren't going to survive as a car company selling to pipe-smoking Brits in their 60s, not at the price point they're envisaging charging. And they had to do something fairly radical and fairly differentiated. And I think it's kind of crazy that it's received this abuse without considering what it is they're trying to do. Because yes, it's a bad move generally to upset your loyal target audience, but that rule does not apply if you're trying to change your target audience. You know, for example, really loyal customers of anything hate it when they advertise. And the reason they tend to hate that is they have a brand as their own pet brand, and they don't like the idea of the brand being shared more widely. A classic example of that is the Great Economist campaign done by David Abbott and others at Abbott Mead Vickers was really unpopular with long-term loyal Economist readers, in the sense that people now thought they were reading The Economist to look clever, whereas they'd always believed they were reading The Economist because they were really clever. Now, the problem there, okay, is that there weren't very many of those loyal Economist readers, and they needed to get more people to read The Economist. In this case, we need different people to consider and then buy Jaguars. And it's exactly the same dilemma that might be faced by musicians. For example, when Bob Dylan went electric, and of course Jaguar is going electric to an extent. When Bob Dylan went electric, somebody shouted Judas and he was violently booed. Okay, people hated the Radiohead album Kid A because the people who'd bought previous work in the past found it deeply unfamiliar. But sometimes as a creative organization, you do have to make these kind of zigzag maneuvers. And my interest as someone who's owned 6 Jags over the course of my life is my principal consideration for the Jaguar brand is that I want the company that supports it to survive.
Yeah, and I suppose like I've seen the futuristic, nearly AI motivated pictures of the new Jaguar cars that look like something I'd say Lego will look like in 20 years. Like, I suppose one of the questions I was going to ask you later is, do you think this is more of a mid to long term plan of Jaguars where it's a complete rebrand and a regeneration of their target market, or do you actually think short term this could have a huge impact on them?
I think that what we have to accept is the fact that electrification has changed the established hierarchy of different car brands. I think Rolls-Royce will be fine. I think Bentley will eventually be fine. Okay. But you suddenly have not only the breakthrough of a whole load of low-cost Chinese brands, which mean that you can't really survive as a European volume car maker very comfortably unless you put up protectionist barriers or something of that kind. But you also get brands like Kia and Hyundai, which were kind of, and actually Skoda to a degree, which were kind of also rans in the petrol car market or the diesel car market, are now considered kind of effectively up there in a leadership position in this new category. And it's rather like, sometimes these things happen, okay? BlackBerry users loved the fact that the thing had a keyboard. I think they were right, by the way. I think that smartphones really, smartphones should have a keyboard. But the fact is that if everybody is switching to the on-screen keyboard, at some point you have to stop listening to your core loyalists and shift somewhere else. I mean, there's a lot of me which thinks that was actually a bad move. It was driven by fashion, and it was driven by the extraordinary kind of power of Apple to determine what's fashionable. The incredible charisma of Steve Jobs, his unbelievable ability to, launch new and radical things, and it was an extraordinary product. But there's a bit of me which goes that probably we lost 5% of GDP in terms of business-to-business productivity when we switched from keyboards to touchscreen smartphones, if I'm being absolutely candid about it.
Yeah, and I was the biggest BlackBerry believer. No,
and you would have been furious if they'd abandoned the keyboard, but you stay completely loyal to your target audience. It's worth remembering that your loyal target audience aren't necessarily, you can always as a business be over-optimized on the past. It's always a perpetual risk as a business that you optimize the business for a world that effectively won't exist in 3 to 4 years' time. And of course, the car market's particularly complicated because every electric car is to some extent a performance car in terms of acceleration and high-end torque. And every electric car is to some extent a luxury car in terms of being incredibly quiet, very pleasant to drive at low speeds and at high speeds, and very, very smooth in terms of acceleration because there isn't a gearbox, right? Okay, so I mean, it's pretty difficult to say that you should take all your kind of brand heritage from the world of cars that consumed dinosaur juice and merely translate that wholesale into the electric car market. Now, okay, Aston Martin's planning something different. They've taken the Lagonda brand and they're making that their electric car brand. I suppose Jaguar could have taken the Daimler brand and made it their electric car brand, conceivably. But the fact was they owned the Jaguar brand. They basically stopped making cars for 2 years in order to reinvent themselves around a completely new platform, a completely new electric architecture. And this is a radical step which, to some extent, they can make because they're a small maker. They only sold 7,000 cars in the US last year. I mean, that's a rounding error. It's nothing. So the fact that occasionally both brands and bands do these things which annoy their existing fan base is not necessarily wrong. Most of the time, it's a terrible idea. You know, when Tropicana rebranded its packaging and, first of all, got rid of that fantastic piece of what you might call semiotics, I suppose, which was the straw stuck into a fresh orange, which said fresh orange juice, okay? When it replaced that with new packaging, that was a completely bonkers thing to do. But then Tropicana, at the time it did that, wasn't in crisis. There wasn't a mass defection of people no longer drinking orange juice, and so on.
Yeah, and like I currently work in sales for HubSpot, which obviously a huge part of our deal is the marketing side of the business. But I suppose what you said there, and it does ring true, even some of my former jobs, I worked with Pinterest and the advertising solutions there with small, medium-sized businesses. And one thing I found, whether it's true businesses or even my own advice or other people I worked with, is that like serendipity plays a huge role in sometimes the success of a marketing campaign or a new product. And as you said, sometimes these decisions seem completely insane. Like you're nearly looking at them going, what the fuck are they thinking doing this? But it actually works somehow.
The funniest case of actually ignoring your fan base is, to some extent, Apple. And everybody forgets that in the light of their success. But if you go to the Apple fanboy chat boards at the time they launched the iPod, which I would argue is the touchscreen iPod, or maybe the iPod itself was kind of their, if you like, their turning point product. The Apple fanboy boards are full of people going, there's one quote, I think, Steve has really lost it this time. Just what the world needs, another portable music player. Okay. So, you know, I mean, I'm totally in favor of a customer focus in terms of perception and experience, but that doesn't mean listening to what your customers say, particularly not your most loyal customers, and always taking it literally. Because actually, in many cases, consumers like brands for reasons they can't really explain on voice anyway. You know, the parts of the brain that do the feeling aren't really connected to the parts of the brain that do the talking. So it can be really dangerous to take market research at face value. It's a really, really dangerous thing to do, and particularly if you overweight it to people who are your notional fans, even if they don't buy you very often. Because it's all very well for people to criticize this advertising, but let's be honest, okay, there are a hell of a lot of people who love the Jaguar brand who ain't buying Jaguars. Okay, you know, I love the Alfa Romeo brand. I've never bought an Alfa Romeo. I think it's a fantastic brand. I've never bought one. And so, you know, I don't think we should allow brands to be kept as kind of pets where people, you know, in other words, people are really, really fond of them. They get really, really upset if they disappear, but they don't actually put their money where their mouth is and buy the things. And, you know, there are loads of classic things. I love red telephone boxes designed by, you know, Charles Gilbert Scott, marvelous red telephone box. But I don't think it should be the BT logo, you know, or the EE logo. Okay, you have to, you know, at some point, technology will wrong foot you. And, you know, let's face it, I'm fairly optimistic about the survival of Jaguar based on what they've done with Land Rover and Range Rover. They clearly know what they're doing in order to sell high-priced, very high-priced, actually, premium automobiles. They clearly know how to do that. They clearly know how to design cars really, really well. Okay, so I'm optimistic about the future of the Jaguar business and consequently the fact that the brand will survive. There are loads of great car brands which don't exist anymore. Duesenberg, okay. Cadillac isn't what it was by any means. What is it, Gordon Keeble? We could all reel off loads and loads of car brands we absolutely love, Trident, which don't exist anymore. Our principal concern should be for the survival of the business, because no business, no brand,
Yeah, and you mentioned just in there where you're more or less
I'm
saying
so sorry.
how
Bloody
you
phone's
can't
ringing.
always take. No, you're okay.
Sorry. Are you on your way home? Ideally, that'd be great. Thanks ever so much. I'm on a Zoom call, so I'll. But come on in, and I've done everything. Okay, I'll explain when you get home.
What time is it now?
I don't know, but if you get here, in half an hour, you're fine. I think if you get here, okay. Super stuff. Bye bye. Right, sorry about that. So I'm this sort of I am this sort of lone voice saying, "Hold on a second." Yes, I completely agree. If this were Tide, the American laundry detergent brand, you would be completely insane to dick around with your brand cues, your familiarity, your package design, etc., in the way they've done. But P&G, who are kind of the smartest tool in the box marketing-wise, did do something really brave with Old Spice. Okay, you know the Old Spice. I'm the chap on a horse with those tickets to these things you love. Okay, now the reason they did that, it was completely radical. But the fact was that Old Spice was dying, and you occasionally, it's rather like a game of poker in business. You occasionally reach these moments where you either just go all in and hope to some extent, okay, you basically push all your remaining chips on the table and place a big bet, because actually, if the alternative is a really slow, depressing decline, then actually playing double or quits is a pretty good strategy, okay? Because what happens? Your big bet fails. Well, you're going to fail anyway, but you're going to fail slowly, okay, which is worse than failing fast. And so, what I actually said was that the brand purist in me doesn't like what Jaguar are doing, but the game theorist in me understands why they're doing it.
Yeah, and no matter what business you're working in now, whether it's even my day-to-day job or what you're involved in, or any marketer worth their weight in proverbial gold, a metric is now so important to top to bottom decisions, even bottom to top decisions. Like if you're a salesperson in a job, you're judged on a metric. How most business owners dictate the success of a marketing campaign is down through click-through rates and other.
It's very, very bad. It's very, very bad, by the way, this metrical obsession, because good statisticians know that there's a thing called quantification bias, which is you become fixated on those things which are either easy to measure, available in numerical form, and quick to reveal themselves. Okay, so fast feedback, numerical feedback, quantifiable feedback gets massively prioritized at the expense of things that are simply harder or slower to measure. And it doesn't matter at first. That's the point. That if you do these short-termist kind of things, which effectively are chasing short-term measures, in the short to immediate medium term, you probably do quite well out of it. Okay, cost cutting would be a classic example of that. Okay, because when you cut costs, the gains appear immediately, and the costs or the opportunity costs appear slowly and less visibly. And so it's a very, very dangerous thing to simply to engage in things like benchmarking exercises or obsessing about particular numerical targets to the expense of subjective judgment. We don't do that. Okay, nobody chooses their wife on, well, unless it's on wealth, I suppose. If you're a total gold digger, I guess. Okay. If you are a total gold digger, you might actually choose a wife on a numerical measure, which is, effectively material wealth. But you might have preferences in one dimension or another, and we won't go into those with, family show and all that. But, but
Yeah.
nobody chooses a house or a life partner purely on the basis of numerical formulae. And there are weird people who try and do that. And they're generally, either a bit on the spectrum or they're kind of obsessive accountants. I mean, a friend of mine, the wonderful Alex Batchelor, who is the marketing director of Royal Mail and a lot of other great brands, he once asked a room full of accountants, come on, admit it, which of you did a cost-benefit analysis before you bought your last car? And he said, out of a room of about 500 people, about 6 hands went up, attached to like really, really sad people, to be absolutely honest. Because, there are loads and loads of factors in choosing a car which are incommensurable and in some cases non-numerical. And it's a complete, I think this idea has been sold to business by the tech industrial complex with their kind of running dog lackeys in management consultancy, that if only you have enough data, all decisions will take themselves. Okay? Or you will have complete control at the top because you will understand everything. And I think it's a false god of perfect quantification, equivalent, if you like, in the sciences to a thing called Laplace's demon, which was an idea formulated by I think he was a French chemist. Was he Laplace? Yeah. Which is, if only you knew enough about each individual atom, you could predict the future. Now, they basically abandoned that notion, certainly with sort of chaos theory and catastrophe theory and so on. They realized that actually interdependent variables are simply too complex to submit themselves to perfect prediction. And I think we ought to accept that in business decision making. I had a great conversation with the guy who founded AO. Do they operate in the Republic? It's appliances online. It's washing machines, dishwashers, etc. It's an online version of Currys, if you like. I'm doing them a disservice there, but that's roughly speaking what it is.
They probably
don't
do.
worry,
that's not my forte.
But he makes a point that there are
ignorance.
certain things they do, like sponsoring the Manchester Arena or giving away teddy bears to households with children, which you can't. Well, you could theoretically, I suppose. I mean, you obviously can't measure the efficacy of sponsoring the Manchester Arena because you can't create a parallel universe. Okay, where the counterfactual applies. It's exactly the same as the UK, except in this parallel universe, AO don't sponsor the Manchester Arena. Okay, you can't do that. You have to use some sort of proxy judgments. And similarly, you could measure the efficacy of giving a bear to a child by having a control region where you don't give away bears, but that would take you 7 years to deliver any kind of meaningful results. Just give away the bears. It's nice. Who's not going to like a bear? It's a rounding error. Your competitors don't do it. That's good enough. Okay? And I think this burden of proof that finance and HR and procurement and compliance, they've basically become the corporate version of the deep state. Okay? They kind of run everything but below the scenes, behind the scenes, without really taking full responsibility in many cases for the full consequences of their actions. They can take credit for cost reductions, but they don't actually pay the cost of lost future revenue or lost customers. And I think this has become very, very dodgy. I think it's become seriously iffy because the demands for perfect information are effectively preventing anybody from exercising subjective judgment or intuition or any other form of decision making other than a kind of very crude cost-benefit analysis equation.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that in the sense that maybe coming at a slightly different direction with, like, I've worked with huge tech companies, whether Accenture, Pinterest, Revolut, most recently HubSpot, and obviously metrics are really important, but I suppose we have COVID to thank for this, where the idea of remote work and the idea of in the office depends on what you're up to, really. You can work wherever you want in Europe. But say, for instance, in Revolut, I was there for about 10 months and I met my team for 30 minutes in person during those 10 months. And that was even out of COVID. And then what I would say, what I found even recently or in my former roles is that like you weren't just, whether it's a sales or marketing executive, whatever your role would be, you're just not purely down to a number. While I feel like post COVID, everything's assessed by that number. It's not like, oh well, Rory, he was very good at the new joiners. He spent extra time after work bringing them to the pub and catching up with them and getting them settled into the team. Or else, oh yeah, Rory, he did X and Y to help
It's a bit
morale at
it's a
that
bit
certain
naughty, isn't
time.
it? Because
It's now
employers
just-
are suddenly demanding the value of serendipity and onboarding and training and mentorship. Okay, but they never actually paid us for those things previously, did they? People did them out of the kindness of their own heart, out of out of natural talent or instinct. But nobody ever said, "Okay, here's another $3,000, Rory, because you were really serendipitous this month." Okay, never actually. So there's a bit of a cheat here, which is they want people to be absolutely subordinate to a productivity target, which measures people on only one thing. But suddenly when people say, well, actually, I can do this one thing from home, they go, oh, no, because you're not doing all the other things. Well, you never measured the other things. I mean, there's a bit of me, I'm quite optimistic about flexible working, not because I think, sorry, just to be clear, I'm optimistic about hybrid working. I think there are jobs, by the way, which you can pretty much quantify perfectly. There are also people who probably work best alone, whom you can trust absolutely. Okay, I think there are categories of people for whom fully remote working can work. And I think in terms of hybrid working, I think we'll ultimately realize that some form of co-location, and it might be in a pub, not an office, by the way. Okay. I mean, no one's actually asked this question. Should we close down the office and take the money we've saved and put 20% of it behind the bar? Because that might not be a bad answer. I mean, genuinely. Okay. People, trust me, people will come in on Thursday if you get to go to the pub afterwards for free drinks. All right. And,
Yeah,
no, in the
especially
UK,
in
I mean,
Dublin.
one of the reasons actually I think the UK has more of a return to the office than the United States does is that the UK and Ireland have more of a drinking culture. I mean, you've got to remember, a lot of Americans drive to work, okay? So you can't really go and neck a few, okay, after you've been to work, because you'll wrap your car around a tree. Whereas in London and Dublin and places, you can do that. But I mean, what we should be doing is not taking sides on the question of remote and flexible working. We should be experimenting and saying, actually, and it requires experimentation partly because there are no hard and fast rules that apply to all people at all the time. Not least because one of the points I'd make is that quite a lot of people come into the office to find solitude because they've got a noisy home life or young kids or a flatmate with Tourette's or whatever it might be. Right. Okay. And those people are coming to the office because they want a library. And there are other people who maybe, if they live alone or their flatmates all work, are all out to work all day, they're coming in for sociability. So the role of the office will vary will almost be a complete opposite, depending on who you're catering to. And I've said, the office of the future is probably half library, half pub. That's not a bad. It's a barbell. It's called the barbell, where the solution to a problem isn't the average of two things. That's the open plan office, which I don't think works very well. It's neither sociable nor is it solitude. Okay, I think the future of the office might be two extremes. And there are a few tech companies which got rid of their offices, but they basically said, okay, we're all off to Ibiza or whatever it is. We'll all go to Ibiza for 2 weeks every 5 months or 6 months. We'll all co-locate in one place and decide what we're doing, and then we'll all effectively go home and do it. Now that's an extreme take. Might work in some cases, but the business, by the way, the business of saying everybody back. It probably works if you're Goldman Sachs because you pay people enough for them to do what they're told. And they probably won't find such good employment elsewhere. Well, on the other hand, what happens if you do that and effectively all the people who can find flexible work elsewhere leave and all the people who can't find another job stay? That's not the most successful form of downsizing.
No,
So
not at all.
one of the important things which we've forgotten this, because partly because of immigration, partly because of um, uh, actually the narrative of the shareholder value movement, etc. Okay, um, capital has been, to quote Scott Galloway, kicking the shit out of Labour for the last 20 years. When I started at work, okay, it was axiomatic that if the company outperformed the market, your salary would outperform the market. Now we've created this absolutely spurious idea of, basically permanent cost cutting and austerity in the workforce. All the perks have gone. Okay, nobody gets a company car anymore. No, all the sort of free drinks, the Christmas parties, the general jollity has been cut back to the bare minimum. Now, that didn't matter when you had a kind of, not quite a monopsony, but when there were a limit to the number of places where specialist people could work. So what happened is people became more and more specialized to a point where they had fewer and fewer potential employers. And those employers were mostly in big cities like London or Dublin. Okay. And therefore, if you had a specialist skill, you were an expert in X, you were basically stuck working in a big city for one of 5 employers. And then the narrative was that there are lots of available people whom we can import into the country, so don't go asking for a pay rise, because otherwise we'll either outsource or we'll import other workers who'll do the job for less than you. Now, flexible work has to some extent put a dent in that, because suddenly where you work and what hours you work are as much open to negotiation as how much you're paid. Previously, where you worked, the hours you worked, those were a constant. The salary was a variable. But actually, there must be a lot of people who go, look, to be absolutely honest, Dublin, by the way, Dublin property prices make London look sane. Okay. I mean, it's seriously bad. I mean, you look at, normally when you come from London or thereabouts, you go and look in the property pages, or you go and look in the windows of a real estate agent, and you kind of have, if I went somewhere like Lisbon, I'd have a little bit of a fantasy browse going, I wonder what I could afford here. And you go, that's actually quite reasonable. You go to Dublin and you go, Jesus, I'd actually leave to live in London for low cost accommodation. Okay. Now, that's a huge tax on your workforce. Demanding they live in Dublin or London is a massive imposition on the discretionary and disposable income of the people who work for you. And more people are going to go, to be absolutely honest, I'd rather work for someone who'll pay me 80% of my salary in a less expensive, or allowing me to live in a less expensive place, than earning 100% of my salary and having to live in some shit bedsit in Clapham or whatever. I mean, it can't. Yeah. I mean, it's who's winning. What I mean is the guy on 100,000 in London or the guy on 70,000 in Lisbon. Whose social media feed looks a bit more enviable? I think we might be able to answer that question. I've just gone kite surfing in March versus, I'm basically walking through the streets of Clapham in the rain. Yeah,
just to escape from my 5 meter by 5 meter flat. But the point or question I was going to, I suppose, go after here was, like, especially with tech companies, I do find that I always find that the messaging around them, whether you look at Meta, Google, even my oldest brother works for Flutter, who obviously in charge of a lot of gambling related companies. A lot of these big tech companies now, when you see ads for them, or when you're on YouTube and you haven't paid for the stupid premium and you see the ads, it's always about like ad campaigns around corporate messaging that doesn't relate to the product. So it's like customer safety, your privacy of the data, employees' rights, or it can even be relating to the LGBT inclusive kind of environments that they're trying to pitch. Like, that question I have for that is, like, is that the right thing for these mega tech companies to be doing now, or has it reached a point where that type of messaging is kind of a bit dated and not necessarily with modern day times?
It depends. I mean, B2B advertising is always aimed at a very, very small. I mean, rightly and wrongly, we can go into the details of that, there is a huge value to being famous, even as a B2B company. And LinkedIn has done the research that shows this. And it's largely because a large part of the decision-making unit won't know the technical or specifications. That they won't know. I mean, there'll be people probably on an IT purchasing committee who don't know the first thing about IT. Okay, but they will be reassured by a familiar name. It does have a huge effect on diminishing fame, has a huge effect on diminishing the doubt and uncertainty of people who aren't expert decision makers. And a large part of corporate decision making is made by people who aren't expert in the specific field in which the decision's being made. So there's a value to just indiscriminate fame in B2B, and very valuable research from the LinkedIn B2B Institute has shown this. At the same time, a large part of B2B will always be playing to the fears of, sometimes the target audience might literally be in. I mean, there are obviously B2B businesses which have a huge target audience. If it's something like, catering, something, Compass Group or something like that. But there'll equally be B2B companies where literally the target audience is known to them individually. Okay. And the advertising there is generally, down to a very, very specific fear of a very, very small group of people. So a lot of B2B advertising will look very weird to passers-by. I mean, funnily enough, when they introduced the B2B category in Cannes and the direct marketing category, I said, for the first time, I know you've always had ads entered without any explanatory context, but you can't do that with B2B, and you can't do that with direct mail, for example, because sometimes you need to know precisely who the target audience is to understand what's clever about the communication. I remember someone bringing me a B2B advertising book where there was an offer where farmers, if they replied to something, got sent Ordnance Survey maps of their farm. I remember thinking, what a really surreal kind of, okay, I mean, maybe you might want one to frame it, but it seems a really surreal offer to give people 15 maps of their farm. It turned out that to get farming subsidies, you need these maps to colour everything in and submit your plans for what you're not growing that year. So actually, it was a really intelligent offer. But when I was looking at this, I thought these people are batshit insane. So in B2B, don't expect B2B advertising to be readily comprehensible. Mark Ritson makes this point. He says the reason most of my case studies are B2C case studies is if I say Guinness, everybody knows instantaneously what it is, whereas if I want to do a case study from a manufacturer of industrial pumping equipment, I need to spend 5 minutes of my time on stage explaining the circumstances of what's going on. And so, no, I think it's, I mean, tech advertising, the problem with tech advertising is actually that tech people hate marketing so much because they have a couple of weird fetishes, one of which is they want to impress their peer group. And the way they impress their peer group is through product superiority as they see it, not as the consumer sees it, but as the technologist sees it. And so you impress your peer group by effectively, and they see marketing as a cost because they think you should win purely on objective, product superiority, without realizing that if you don't tell a good story about your product, it doesn't matter how superior it is among your highly specialist peer group, nobody will want to buy it because they can't understand it. And the other thing is that a substantial amount of advertising is needed to reassure people if you're asking them to fundamentally do something new.
And with, I suppose, when you're talking about those things with regards to marketing, I absolutely have to bring up the two letters of AI, considering that in the last 12 months alone, the impact it's had from my day-to-day life, whether it's God knows what I'm typing into Chat GPT or else even in work. A lot of our tools are built around AI, and sure, with HubSpot, AI is a huge part of the company at the moment. But when it comes to marketing, day-to-day life, like where, and again, this is pretty much the biggest gray area question I can give to you, Rory. So apologies in advance. But from an AI point of view, do you think in the next couple of years it's going to be a positive enhancement, or do you think it's going to be a negative one?
Both, probably. I mean, there is a fundamental danger to the whole thing, particularly if we consider AI in the part of large. Oh God, the fucking phone's going again. Sorry.
It's okay.
Hello.
Hi.
That's fine. Absolutely super. No problem at all. See you in 10 minutes. Yeah, I'll be ready, more or less. Yeah, no problem. Thanks.
I won't come in.
Yeah, come in. You can come in. Seriously. Okay, no problem. I'll see you then. Righty-ho. Bye-bye. I mean, one of the problems. Sorry about this.
No, you're okay.
Picture the camera's actually picked up you rather than me, rather weirdly. So let me go. It's got a face recognition thing, which is wildly annoying. There we go. That's better. It'll pick me up now. The last thing the world needs, in a way, is yet more average quality content. So the automation of the generation of text and images, yes, in the hands of really talented people, I have absolutely no doubt that really remarkable things will be done. But there is a problem in that, maybe it's in that when everybody has the capacity to generate, I mean, how shall I put it this way? One of the examples I gave is that if you go back to your time as a student, your essays you wrote as a student are completely worthless. You probably haven't kept them. If you reread them, you'd be embarrassed. They're probably been thrown away, but if they're not, they're in a garage somewhere and no one's going to read them. And unless you become some Nobel Prize winning writer, no one's going to publish them, print them, or even bother looking for them. But the value of those essays wasn't actually in the essays. It was the work you had to do in order to write them. And one thing that worries me about AI is that the value of doing, this is an old Jeremy Bullmore point, the value of doing advertising may not be in the advertising you produce or even in the fact that you run it, but it's in the questions you have to ask in arriving at a message. Okay, so the process, painful and costly and time consuming though it may be more valuable than the product. And if you shortcut that process, which is very much the promise of AI, don't worry about anything else. We'll just get you straight to a fairly good ad. And you bypass all those questions and wrong turns, and you end up with just yet more average content that's unsurprising but adequate. Okay. That's actually a problem. It seems to be making things faster and easier. And I'm sure there are students who more or less got through, their terrifyingly their medical qualifications by heavy reliance on large language models, okay, to produce essays. Whether I want them operating on me in 10 years' time is a slightly different question. And so, I mean, the other thing that bothers me is that in terms of the automation of work, I think there are still, interestingly, blind spots in what AI can't do. It seems to be incapable of producing jokes, which is interesting because, there are a lot of jokes. It must know what humor is. But when it attempts to be funny, you've got various AIs where you can program it to give a kind of wry, cynical, sarky, bantery kind of answer. But there do seem still to be holes in terms of what it's capable of. And maybe what it's incapable of is the product of what's called abductive inference, which is you imagine something and then you effectively work backwards. It's the question of, what if, what would have to be true if, suppose that. Now, it might be really, really useful in once someone has had one of those abductive or imaginative leaps, you know, once Frank Lloyd Wright has decided to put the building on top of the waterfall or to make the art gallery a spiral, okay, once that decision has been made, once you've had that extraordinary kind of creative leap, maybe actually in terms of filling in some of the space afterwards or coming up with alternative interpretations of an idea, maybe this can be really, really valuable. I'm not totally sure it gets you to that place to begin with. And it'll be interesting. I mean, AI music will be an early sort of indicator. You know, are there, you know, other human art forms like conversation? It's okay, is my view. I mean, it's all right, but it's also probably, to be honest, a bit Californian. Yeah, I don't mind the fact that AI is American, because, you know, there's 60 million of us, there are 5 million of you, okay, in Ireland, okay, there are a few Australians and Canadians and so forth, but there are 350 million of them. So I know the fact that AI is going to be a bit American, but you know, I could do with New Jersey AI, or, you know, you know, something, you know, something a little, you know, Southern AI or Texan AI. It's just a tiny bit kind of vanilla and anodyne at the moment. And but I mean, we don't have to worry, because the greatest people to profit from this initially will be kind of scam artists, pornographers. You know, it's rather like, you know, it's rather like when you fertilize a field. Okay, you fertilize the plants and the crops and the flowers and the weeds. And if you use this to fertilize areas which are already, you know, weed infested, there are aspects of the undesirable economy out there which might profit from this disproportionately and profit from it first. I already noticed this, by the way. If you look at search and the whole concept of search words. Now, admittedly, I have a defense, because I had COVID at the time and I wasn't really on my A game. Okay, so I was suffering from COVID, and I realized we had to get these Canadian equivalent of an Ester, which is kind of, it costs about 14 Canadian dollars, which is like £7, about 8 euros, I guess, to go into Canada. And I go onto a well-known search engine and search, and I pick one that looks highly plausible, and I go and pay $50 for this Canadian entry visa thing. And if you go to the main Canadian government site, the same thing cost $14. But the Canadian government site was number 9 on the search engine algorithm. Now, hold on a second, right? Okay. You have a problem there, because the person who's scamming me will always be able to outbid the legitimate seller. And so, you know, it's worth noting that if you discover a scam, you know, if you discover a really clever hack, all right, those things are disproportionately profitable. And so the money that will be available to devote to these technologies for illegitimate ends may be far, far higher than the money that's investable by people who are pursuing perfectly legitimate commercial ends. So, you know, we have to be genuinely terrified, okay? What's the most profitable thing you can do? It's to get someone to give you money and give them nothing in return. Someone can effectively mock my daughter's, I've got 2 daughters, one of my daughter's voices, and ring me up and go, "Dad, I'm in trouble. I need 500 quid because these crack dealers are onto me." Okay. Well, you know, that, okay.
Like the Terminator,
you know, at this point, you've found extraordinary weaknesses. I mean, there is a danger, okay, which is that some marketing, by and large, legitimate marketing, we're kind of proof against. We have a degree of immunity. I can't, you know, obviously there are cases like gambling where I'm really uncomfortable about targeted advertising for online gambling sites. Simply because in the old days, if you had a gambling problem, you could escape from temptation to some degree. You know, don't buy the, you know, Sporting Life, don't read the sports pages, stay out of a casino, you know, whereas actually in the digital world, will your worst habits follow you everywhere you go? And also, will those people simply become disproportionately good through what you might call turbocharged kind of evolutionary experimentation at separating people from money at the expense of legitimate businesses? We have to be really nervous about this, because I mean, there patently are cases, okay, where great marketing serves really bad ends. I mean, the Nazis were crackingly good at branding, right? Okay, you can actually buy them. They're collectible. Yeah. They are Nazi-era brand guidelines, which are all about like the relative size of a swastika on a flag and how something hangs. So, I mean, literally, you can deploy these skills for commercial ends. You can deploy them for charitable ends. You can deploy them for entirely benign ends. In some cases, very, very pro-social activity can be driven by marketing. We see a marketing success story at the moment, which nobody talks about very much, but the sudden growth in low and zero alcohol beer as an alternative. I'm not a temperance nut, but the widespread availability and acceptance of zero alcohol beer is the kind of outcome which government health organizations would have fantasized about 10 years ago, but it's actually happened spontaneously through the discovery of really, really good Lucky Saint might have been decisive. Guinness has been undoubtedly really valuable in this, because the zero alcohol Guinness is a fantastic facsimile of the alcoholic product. So marketing is just a thing. The value of it socially depends on the use to which it's put. And my only concern is it the bad actors who have the most money to invest in this and the most time to experiment with what works? And simply because generally ripping people off is an incredibly profitable business. And what are we going to do to defend against this?
Yeah, it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard to know, and it's funny you bring up the Guinness 0.0 thing, because when that came out, my dad said that's essentially like trying to put a condom on and have sex with a sofa rather than the real thing. So it's glad to prove him wrong.
In fairness, okay. I mean, one, it's an alternative. There are a lot of people who are driving who, to be honest, there's quite a strong placebo effect to the act of drinking beer, which contains no alcohol. I think particularly true if you're a regular drinker. So what I'm saying is, if you have 1 pint of alcoholic Guinness and then a second pint of non-alcoholic Guinness, I think that the second pint does contribute a bit towards bonhomie and relaxation, simply through a kind of mental placebo effect. And if that means people can go out for an evening and have 1 pint of alcoholic Guinness and 2 pints of non-alcoholic Guinness, drive home safely and have a good time with their friends, I'm just going to open the door. I'm all for it. Wait me a second.
Yep. No worries.
Hi there. Come on in. There we go. And back to... I should be back in the room now. Here we go.
Yeah. Well, no, I
So there's a marketing component to every bit of behavioural change, because people fundamentally need reassurance, both social reassurance and individual reassurance, before they change their behaviour, before they adopt any new behaviour. One of my favourite you asked me my favourite ads for the last. I was at Kilconomics about a month ago, and I showed an ad from the what was called the Electricity Supply Board in Dublin, in Fleet Street, Dublin, Use Electricity, which making the point that the electrification of homes, from 1910 to 1940, required quite a lot of marketing effort. And someone came up to me afterwards and said that their grandfather, I think, worked for the ESB. And his job was to persuade particularly more rural Irish communities to get electricity in their homes. And the solution he found was effectively a social influencer solution, which is every month he bought the priest a bottle of whiskey on condition that in his sermons the priest would casually drop a reference to how much he liked having electricity in his own house. Okay. It's fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. Yeah. I have to dash, unfortunately. I've got to go. Unfortunately, I've got to go into London, which is massively annoying to me. But if we stop now, I will leave it to upload. I hope it's uploaded the video okay. And at this point, I'll turn my computer off and see what the hell it's